Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are doing Ask Me Anything today, Wildcard Edition. First, a quick note about me. If we've not met already, I'm a business owner, author, speaker, educator, advocate, and consultant. I specialize in emerging collection programs, digital collection management, and grant acquisition strategy. I've had 15 years serving in archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations, and I have a master's in library and information science with a concentration in archives management. So why am I doing this Ask Me Anything session? First of all, I'm celebrating. My business just turned 4 years old on May 2nd. And so this is a fun event for me to do to help celebrate with you. Second reason, I have seen a lot, especially in a 15-year career thus far. And working with dozens of clients and organizations, I've seen and done a lot. And then third, you have my gratitude. Thank you so much for showing up, especially this last year. Starting out doing these webinars, it was initially just a COVID response. But since they have gained so much interest from yourselves and you showing up to each of these webinars, asking great questions, it's really been a rewarding experience. And so we will be continuing to do these sorts of programs even when the pandemic is finally over. So how does this work? Ask Me Anything, at least for this version, the questions are pre-submitted. And so I've gathered them and put them together. We are collating and anonymizing, so questions that were somewhat similar, we put them together. And for the questions, we may have edited them for clarity and or to remove any sort of identification in case that is needed. And then third, there's a chat. It is on, I believe, this side of your screen. If you have a YouTube account, I believe you can participate in the chat. So with any resources, questions you might have, etc., please feel free to use it. And then if you are having trouble seeing this, especially if you're in the webinar room for the premiere, there is a full screen option and also closed captioning if that is something that you need. If you do not have a YouTube account and or are having problems using the chat, you can always email me because these are pre-recorded and premiere. I am there in the chat box with you, and I have the opportunity to check my email and grab questions I see from there. So if for some reason you can't or don't want to use the chat, we can do it that way too. My email is consulting@rachaelcristine.com. Rachel is Rachael, and Christine is without the H, Cristine. Quick disclaimer, your mileage may vary. So for the questions that we answer today, some of them can be very situational dependent or software dependent. So depending on what your particular setup, situation, background, etc. is, please apply this advice and strategy appropriately. First up, we're starting with a good, big, juicy question. It is, what common bad choices / downfalls do you see in archives and small historical societies? And how can they be avoided? So love the question and love that you are solutions oriented. So from what I have seen, first and foremost, the very first thing that came to mind was scarcity mindset. If you are not familiar, scarcity mindset is when people and or organizations are constantly in a mode and constantly make decisions based on a lack of. The lack of can be literal or perceived, and it's usually a lack of or interpreting a lack of money / resources. And so with that, scarcity mindset tends to breed a lot of internal competition, jealousy, some toxic environment kind of stuff within organizations, because there's the not enough to go around feeling or belief in those situations. Part of this is situational. It could very well be that there's not enough money to go around, but I have found that the people who set the tone in the organization and the emotional health of the organization, so both managers and administrative staff, but also staff and colleagues that tend to take more leadership roles, whether informally or formally, they're the ones that can influence this mindset for better or worse. And so, unfortunately, especially at smaller shops and ones that are run by people who maybe aren't experienced or have a schooling or an experienced background to be running small shops, it can be very difficult. And that's where we tend to find the scarcity mindset. How to work around or get out of that, trying to manage up is one of the strategies there, realizing that there is restrictions on just how much we have control over. Trying to separate yourself and create some boundaries so that you are not getting sucked into that feeling and are able to start forming and finding your own solutions to your problems to get the resources you need. So, for example, that's one of the main reasons I taught myself how to do grant writing, because I needed money to do the projects we were supposed to be doing. So, making sure that you're carving out a space for yourself where you can do that solution creation and solution planning and are not being impacted by this mindset. Next one, blinders or tunnel vision. And this is where, again, with the smaller shops, especially, or for organizations, no matter what size, that are chronically understaffed, it can be very easy for particularly management to get very overwhelmed, in a state of overwhelm, and start developing tunnel vision, or I always imagine horse blinders. And so they can only literally see what is in front of them instead of the whole landscape of what it is they're supposed to be in charge of and stewarding. And with that mode in mind, not only does that perpetuate the scarcity mindset because you're only working on like one thing at a time, it also prevents you from doing any sort of creative thinking, collaborating with other partners, noticing affinities or opportunities, that kind of thing. So, in order to help combat this, first of all, realize that you are doing it or that your boss is doing it, and finding ways to break out of it, particularly bringing on staff that have a project management capacity certainly helps, at least with the logistics of that, as well as doing very periodic check-ins. So, if you've got annual goals in a report, break those down into quarterly and monthly check-ins and reports in terms of what are your priorities, how are they going, and don't lose track of them, and sort of help pull you out of whatever the sort of the urgency tunnel vision that is happening. Next one, staff overworked and underappreciated. And for me, taking care of staff not only is the literal job of your boss and manager, but it is also their ethical responsibility to make sure that you as humans and you as human resources are taken care of and have the things that you need to be productive in your job, but to also function at your best capacity, to be healthy, and to even be happy. That is, that is something that we should have in our workforce. And unfortunately, and again, I don't know, for many of these setups, the managers tend to be those that were promoted or put in positions where they are in charge of people, but have never received nor sought out training for how to actually take care of those people. Now, part of this is on whoever promoted them, but most of this is on them for never seeking out the education and experience that they obviously need. Unfortunately, this is very predominant, especially in our field and related fields, where people that are in these positions that are supposed to be taking care of their staff have sort of that inferiority complex and fear, imposter syndrome, which is something we all suffer from, but it's not an excuse in their case. And so trying to break through that, especially knowing that there's that fraud fear for them, is difficult. Um, I wish I had a better solution for this one. My advice to you, because you are likely not a manager in this position, is to not take it. If your manager is overworking you and or you're being underappreciated, make sure that you're being vocal about that, especially for the overworked component. What is it that is actually on your job description? Maybe even quantifying the hours and the projects that you're working on and showing the math that it is literally impossible for you to work on all of those things, and that you are not being paid for overtime or work outside the office. And for the underappreciated part, this if you're a good boss, then your employees and staff should know how much they are appreciated every day. For the staff that I have supervised and currently supervise, I say thank you every day for whatever it is that they have worked on. If they've turned in something and it's amazing and exactly what I need, just being very free with the acknowledgement and the affirmation that the work that they are doing is critical to you doing your job. Now, if you're the employee in this situation and not the manager, if you are not getting it from them, seek it out elsewhere. And also, don't be afraid to um, communicate and be proud of your own accomplishments within your organization. So, for example, this was a really bad problem at my first job for many reasons. And so I had to toot my own horn, which is something that one of the staff had reflected to me at that point in time, but that it was so necessary because the things that we tend to do and work on, especially in larger organizations, are chronically underappreciated. So praise yourself, be very transparent and vocal about your accomplishments, work with your peers and maybe outside committees that would be more appreciative, but be someone who provides it to yourself and find avenues to seek it from others. Next one, lack of investment in people and tools. So again, your staff, they are literal human resources that you need to get the organization moving and maintained. And just the lack of investment. I mean, if you've seen some of my other webinars, you know that our field is not in a healthy position, in this case financially, and that people are chronically underpaid, not only for the expertise and education, but also for where they live and cost of living, let alone things like student investment in your education, so student loan debt, etc. So we need to pay people more is my point here, and we need to be better about that, not only because again it's an ethical as well as a professionally mandated thing, but also because if you pay people more their worth, so it's not just more, you're paying people their worth, period, then they will tend to stick around longer. They will be happier. They will be more productive. There are so many business cases and psychological reasons as to why you should be paying people their worth. And tools, of course, we need the right tools to do our job. And the better the tools are, the better we can do our job. And most of the time, the more time we save when we have the right tools. For example, having a really great collections management system that can automate things, can help you do batch or bulk workloads versus a not great collections management system, can really make a huge difference time wise in terms of what your staff have to do, and can make their lives better. And then the last one that I tend to see is missing expertise and skill sets. Again, when we're in these smaller shops, or if we're in where there's not a lot of finances to go to bring on staff and or consultants, museums, archives, historical societies are still trying to do all of the jobs they think they're supposed to be doing. But if they don't have that expertise or skill set, they first of all don't have any business doing it, and shouldn't be doing it for fear of damaging the collections. And second of all, like you need people who know how to do it. Otherwise, you're asking people to do things they don't know how to do, that will take more time, there will be mistakes, etc. It's just not a good way to run any sort of collection management program. So those are the things that I tend to see the most. And while some of them are systemic and are not things we have full control over, hopefully I've been able to provide some insight and strategy for how to deal with those. Next question. I started doing archives consulting and freelance work last year. I have many years of experience as an archivist and archives manager, but I am learning the business aspects as I go. One thing that I struggle with is billable hours. What's billable? What's not? I also find that I sometimes underreport and thus undercharge my hours to the client if a task takes longer than I think it should. And I have thought and done all of these things. You are not alone. So, first one, what's billable? Everything. Every time you type out an email, every time you answer their call, every time you type up some notes, everything is billable. If you wouldn't be doing it, like if they weren't your client and you wouldn't be doing it, then that means that it's billable to that client. So keep that in mind. And then related to that, the underreporting and undercharging, it really leads to then an undervaluing of yourself, which is a violation and disrespect to yourself, which is some strong language there. But hopefully to serve as motivation for you are the only one who can say what your worth is. And if you are not holding to that or respecting that, it psychologically it can get very dark and difficult in there, and I have been there, which is why I put it that way. So let that serve as motivation in terms of thinking about the what's billable, and then making sure that you are reporting and charging for the work that you're doing. I definitely get the sentiment of, oh, that took longer than I thought it would or estimated, or that took longer than I would have liked it to, because you ran into very reasonable natural project hiccups, etc. Do resist that, and still charge for it, because that is a real life circumstance that happens all the time. And no matter what, it goes back to, if you did the work for them, then charge for it. So I feel your tender heart in terms of wanting to be really good about that, but you do need to put yourself first. And part of that is because if you don't, it's going to become increasingly stressful, especially if work is taking longer and you're not charging for it. You are not recouping any of those hours to do other work. So you're costing yourself twice. You're costing yourself from what the client should be paying for, and you're costing yourself because you also can't work on anything else because you're doing that work for free. So don't do that. It is stressful. And then also it can damage you, your work, and your client, and the relationship that you have with your client when you are in this situation, because you put yourself in this situation. It hurts you because it's stressful. It hurts you financially. It hurts your work because, at least in when I am in this mode, there's that stress to, oh, I should hurry up and do it because I'm not charging for it, or it shouldn't have taken this long, I should wrap this up thing, which is never what you want to bring with you when you're working on a project. And then also with your client, like your client doesn't want to, hopefully, if it's a good client, doesn't want you to be doing this work for free or feel stressed or cost you money. And in the end, whether they realize it, obviously or not, is they also don't want you to be performing that work in that mode either, because you're not at your best. And then you can always make an exception. So for the many projects I've done throughout the years, I've gotten fairly good at estimating, which is something you will get the muscle memory for too as you go along. And you can always make an exception. So if, for example, it's a grant and there isn't any money left, You can make an exception and donate some of your time. One way you could do that that's beneficial to you is if you donate a product that you could do a tax write-off for. So like the end product for that grant is a report is a product. I am not a tax accountant, so definitely ask your tax accountant about that, but that is something that I have been told. And exception wise, also, there's always room to negotiate. So even if the scope of work had you doing A, B, and C, but B took extra long, and so there's not uh, as much time for C, then negotiate the scope, bring the scope down a little bit so that it matches what time you have left, or have them increase the budget so that it can actually, you can complete C in the way that you are supposed to, which gets back to just being honest and communicate with the client in terms of this is where we're at, this happened, this is a normal part of projects, these things happen, this is where I'm at, what would you like to do with this? Would you like to review and revise the scope? Would you like to increase the budget? Like, let's work on this together kind of thing. So hopefully that helps. This one I love. So we're going to get into some nitty gritty archives standards. My question concerns date estimation and recording for archival materials. DASCs, which is Describing Archives, a Content Standard, sections 2.412 and 2.415 deal with estimated single dates and date ranges, but don't provide much guidance beyond being clear and consistent. I'm smiling because so much of our best practices is a it depends situation. Are there any widely recognized conventions within the archival community concerning the range of uncertainty? So, for example, circa 1950 means 1940 to 1960. Approximately 1922 means 1920 to 1924, etc. 1890s does seem pretty obvious, and I do agree with that one. One possibility, not explicitly mentioned in DAX, but that covers a lot of railroad photographs, would be mid-20th century. Any problem with that because it's not a DAX estimated format. So I have several answers. Also, thank you for this amazing question. Geek moment for a moment. That should be word, not work. My apologies. The word circa is Latin for about. So it's in and of itself is the estimate. And in looking at some of the other best practices that I've seen out there, the consensus seems to be that when we're doing a circa for a decade, doing the 1940 to 1949 versus 1940 to 1950, this tends to be the preferred 40 to 49 and then like 50 to 59, etc. for that decade. You are correct. You could also then just do 1940s if you want it to be 1940 to 1949. I believe our preference as archivists is with the circa, and I believe that's what the DAX manual predominantly uses. Getting into 1922, so we're moving from a decade to within that year. This tends to mean like we feel really good about it being 1922, but it could conceivably be 1 year less or more. So 1921, 1923. So that is the sort of the insinuation with that sort of date. Mid-19th century, if you're trying to hit like the 40s and the 50s, it certainly, as a historian, that is accurate. The question is, and what I get into in this next bullet point though, is what is the date for? And if you're getting into DAX and if you're working on the project that I think you're working on, then the date is for a catalog, and the catalog is intended to be searched and do some drilled down with dates maybe. And so when you use a more narrative format or textual versus alphabetical versus numerical, then it's going to make it harder to search. And so if this is a database driven decision for things that we would like to be findable, stick with numbers as best as you can. So in this case, for this very particular situation, when you're wanting to say something is mid-19th century, I would have you stick with the decade, if you can get it down to a decade. So either doing that circa 40 to 49 or just 1940s, whichever way your system prefers that or works best with is what I would recommend. So hopefully that makes sense. That, as you could tell, there's no like hard or fast rule, but if you're doing this for a database, stick with numbers. But any of these combinations are technically correct. So you can't go wrong there. Question: when we started planning for our library expansion, we had plenty of funds available to cover the expense, assuming we used a grant writing consultant to leverage our assets. We still hope to do this, but inflation and prices for building materials continue to wreak havoc in the total building cost. It occurs to me that we might have to supplement what we have available to us. What are some of the tricks and suggestions of how to organize and implement a successful local fundraiser in a small community? Okay, so before I get into the fundraising part of this, a couple suggestions and just an affirmation that construction costs at the best of times are always tricky. And especially in this last year, with everybody redoing houses and landscaping, etc., it has been a nightmare in terms of trying to keep costs low for capital sort of projects. So, a note on inflation and using cost urgency. When you are trying to do an assortment of fundraising, donor awards, grants, etc., the problem is that the grants part, well, and the fundraising part takes time. And so there's, even at the best of times, always that issue of building materials becoming more expensive. So using that urgency as a motivator can be helpful. So thinking of it and using it in grants, for example, they are usually, even if it's not officially on the scoring rubric, they do tend to pay attention to which projects have a sense of urgency, which sort of intangibly affects the scoring in terms of, well, they clearly need the money, not only in terms of they met all of the rubric stuff, but they need the money now because this painting is disintegrating or this roof is going to collapse in, that kind of thing. So using the cost of construction and the inability to build the building at some point once it becomes too expensive is a point of urgency that you can sort of use in your favor in the grant application, but also in talking with funders to help motivate them to reach the fundraising goal, whatever it is, more quickly. Okay, time out here real quick. In recording this webinar, I realized I completely forgot to address the contingent contract bullet point. And this idea I want to make sure we get down because when working with construction companies, and especially if you are a nonprofit organization or a municipal organization, somewhere where your budgets and your funds are fairly strict, sometimes partnering with or finding a construction company you can partner with that understands and supports that situation can really be helpful in these types of situations. So whether that is putting into place a contingent contract where you commit to working with that company, assuming that the funding comes in, and that way sort of locking in some of the costs ahead of time is sometimes an option. Another thing you can do that I've seen be successful is when you're partnering with construction companies, and especially those local to your organization, they also have an investment in your organization being successful. And there are sometimes compromises that you can strike or negotiations made in terms of, okay, we can pay for materials up to this price. At that point, is there a way we can do it at cost, or is there an option where some of the cost could possibly be donated and so therefore a tax write-off for that construction company? So, there is some room where we can get creative And assuming that you have a good partner to work with, I have seen each of those examples in action. So worth a try. Okay, time back to the original presentation. Speaking of in answering your actual question, the local community fundraising, I find that a concise, like simple, open, and honest call is very compelling. So being honest and using that sense of urgency about the construction costs being astronomical, and being open about what it is that you need and how people can help you meet it. So, do you need to get $50,000 by, Q3 or what have you, or by November of this year, things like that? Why you're, tell them the problem, why you're in that situation, the urgency around it, and how they can help you. So, framing it in that way and using an honest approach. Also, things that have been popping up in conversations, especially among museums this last week at AAM, the knowledge and data around micro donations is getting better and better. And we are finding that in the museum setting for donations in general, that micro donations are becoming the majority of donations for most museums. And so while having donors with large amounts of money is certainly very helpful, not underestimating the power of people giving 20, 50, 100, what have you dollars, whatever it is that they can, it is still helpful. And so when you're putting out that call or organizing the whatever fundraising mechanism, making sure that those people feel empowered and that it really does help if they give that money, even if it is a smaller amount. So realizing and harnessing the power of micro donations. Also, make sure you find out a way to do it online because, while many donors are able to write checks, etc., the majority of the population at this point is now wanting to give donations online. So remember that. Another thing to think about is pledges versus cash in hand. And this can help get into the next point with competition, but going around and getting pledges can help in terms of getting people excited about it. They don't have to write the check right away, but it helps you build some momentum. And you can do that versus feeling like you need to have the cash in hand. So it's a way for you to move forward without having necessarily all of the cash together to then spend, because if you're trying to do that, you may never get there. And then this also helps with competition, especially if there are some local corporations, organizations, tourism boards, etc. Um, it can be very helpful to be transparent and share who else has given. And this is organizations and companies, not personal people, but as sort of an incentive to be like, well, the grocery store, etc., gave this, but the restaurant gave that. So, like, what could you do, kind of thing. Thinking about local foundations and funders, each state has their own very local foundations, and you can, if you have a library near you, there's usually books of funders that may not necessarily have their own website, but of course there's websites too that keep track of those databases. And figuring out which ones are local to you, because the more local they are, the more they will care about your local issue, which in this case with construction is going to be a building in their area that they could benefit from and the community could benefit from. Having events of course cost money. So I usually hesitate to recommend that, especially for organizations that may not normally do events to begin with. But they can be exciting, especially if they're a one-off, whether it's a lecture or fun community event. Maybe you can partner with a restaurant and have proceeds go towards the project, etc. Getting creative there, where it wouldn't be a lot of cost outlay for you, but could help generate a lot of money. And then, of course, honoring. So, depending on what you're building and how many things you could name, naming the foyer was thanks to Jane Smith, for example, or these beautiful bookcases or stacks were because of so and so, or even the bricks. In fact, I think those are some of the most popular because again, people can buy in at a lower price, but their name is in a brick on the ground, and people get really excited about that. um, it's they feel like they're a part of it, right? And so having different ways people can buy in and having different ways you can honor and recognize those contributions, all of those will help, especially when you're thinking about local community fundraising. So hopefully those ideas get you going. Question: I still cannot seem to understand what is the difference between a content management system and a collections management system. What are the concrete actions that can be made with both types of systems? And what information do they hold about the collections? So first of all, at least in 2021, I'm pretty sure they're the same thing, and are used interchangeably, at least currently and in the States. I did bring a screenshot over here on the right-hand side from the International Council on Archives. And I think this might also be a language thing. So for example, catalog, Americans spell it the simple way. So Catalog, catalog. Yep, I can spell. Whereas in Britain, at least, and maybe the rest of the Commonwealth, they add the UE at the end. So I think this may be a different verbiage type thing depending on where you are. And all of the collections management systems that they list in their content management system section all refer to themselves as collection management systems. So I think this helps lend some credence to they are the same thing. But I do want to get into some differences about systems that we are using in our field in general, especially since our field is cross-disciplinary. So there's the idea of a knowledge management system versus a content management system. And knowledge management in this case, and there are databases for it, is really intellectual property, ideas, institutional knowledge, um, that type of thing, usually in more of a corporate or research setting. Whereas content is actual like marketing collateral, for example, or book narrative manuscript type content. That is things that were written to convey ideas, branding, etc. That's content, which you could find in marketing departments, and they may have systems called content management systems to help them manage all of that collateral. And then getting to content versus collections, which we went over at the beginning of this slide. For our purposes in the library, archives, and museum field, they're the same. And more commonly, we do tend to, at least in the States, say collections management systems. And they are to manage historical artifacts, essentially, or if you're in libraries, books. But for archives and museums, you've got the historical artifacts, whether it's object or paper, photo, audiovisual material, etc. So historical materials, and then the data that goes with those materials to describe and sort and manage those materials. And then we have collections versus digital assets. And this is one that is particularly interesting to me right now because we are starting to see this merger of collections management systems with digital asset management systems. So CMS versus DAMS. And I'm starting to see this bleeding over of collections management systems starting to offer functionality like a DAMS. For example, thinking about digital file preservation management, external, internal file sharing, that type of thing. And similar with the DAMS, where I'm starting to see them offer collections management system functionality in terms of the curating content, creating digital galleries, that type of thing. So I think we may see a time in the next 5, maybe 10 years where collections management systems and digital asset management systems may very well be the same thing. just as now collection management systems and content management systems are the same thing. Great question. That was a fun rabbit hole to go down. Question. I have a permanent position in the archives world, but I'm miserable at my workplace. I feel guilty since permanent full-time work is so hard to come by, but it's been hurting my mental health for years. Is it irresponsible to leave for a temporary archives position at another institution? How do you balance mental health and job security in the library and information science world? And first of all, I'm really sorry to hear it. You are not alone in that, which isn't comforting, but I guess just know you're not alone. So I do want to talk about a couple of things here. First of all is gratitude and grief. It is possible to feel both at the same time. So you can be grateful for your job and yet still feel the profound grief of being unhappy, um, being mistreated, all of the things that might be contributing to your unhappiness in your particular position. So it's possible to have both. It does not mean you should or have to stay there, though. And that there is a grief around that. When I was in my last position, I think part of the reason why it took so long to leave was the grief, the anticipatory grief I was feeling of leaving a position that, for many reasons, was a dream, and yet still feeling miserable. And then also the grief of, if I leave this position, will I ever be in the archives or museum world again? Jobs are hard to get, as everybody knows. And so grief from that too, of if I voluntarily give up this job, will I still be just as miserable and not be able to find a job after that? Which gets me into my next point, which is the concept of golden handcuffs. And this particular phrase I hear a lot, especially in academia. And the idea is that you are in a position where it is so prestigious, it is so exciting or highly valued externally. Um, it's people think what you do is so cool. You're so lucky to have that job. It's so hard to find another job if you wanted or needed to. All of those things are on the surface level seemingly very good things that you can't or shouldn't leave. And because of that dynamic, it is handcuffing you to what is an awful situation because you supposedly have this amazing job. Then there's the mental health versus the job security aspect of this. Mental health, it's amazing how much can impact it and how resilient we can be and how much we can endure. But how much our mental health can then impact physical health and everything else if we aren't able to take care of ourselves in that way. And that is becoming increasingly an issue for so many of us in the field as we butt up against the issue of job security. So the field doesn't have enough jobs seemingly for everybody. I would actually phrase that as the field doesn't have enough money to fund all of the jobs it should be funding, because then we would have plenty of jobs. There's certainly enough to do, right? And or they are not paying what they should be paying for people of the education and experience and responsibilities that so many of us have. So you're really trying to balance these two very critical aspects that impact your life in so many ways, mental health included. So how do you even navigate that? And there's not a good or straight answer, but I think realizing what a tough spot you're in, because the first thing we do tend to think about is the job security issue or the job scarcity issue. But what we also need to be critically aware of is where our mental health is at, because for so many of us, in my case, it impacted my physical health irrevocably. So that is not worth it and has become such a longer term problem than the short term problem of job security. And also, what is really irresponsible here? So I want to sort of challenge you on the idea that it would be irresponsible to leave your job, which I agree on the surface level. And if you're asking my parents, maybe it would seem irresponsible to quit a job because you're unhappy to hopefully find something else, but knowing the job market's not great. It on the surface definitely seems irresponsible. However, would it not also be irresponsible to keep yourself in a position in which you are miserable and that is impacting your health? So think about that. While you're in there, though, and I realize this is a slow process, you can't just extract yourself miraculously from this bad situation. What is within your control? So start insulating yourself, start setting up boundaries, start deciding what it is you will put up with or not, and trying to really insulate yourself from as much as you can that is awful there. Um, Whether that's staying away from certain people, whether that is not doing certain jobs or committees. And I realize not all of this is within your control, but as best as possible, try and start insulating yourself and controlling what you can. And what boundaries can you build? So if it's with your boss, this is obviously very hard and intricate, but figuring out what allies you have there, whether in a formal structure or informally, what classes can you take to help build up yourself as a person and professional, invest in yourself? What ways can you work with your boss that limits some of the awful behavior, for example, or if it's coworkers, same thing. And just figure out where it is that you can put in some boundaries. And just a reminder that just because it is your job to work there, it is not your job to put up with bullshit. So, calling people on it and building boundaries, while initially is intimidating, it is also very thrilling and ultimately better for you and probably many of your coworkers. So, I encourage you while you are in that situation to start experimenting with protecting and insulating yourself and making sure that you're creating the work situation that you can tolerate and survive. Be damned to the consequences. So, those were some very good, intricate, not easy questions. You did not disappoint. So, thank you so much for sending those in, especially the ones where, I mean, obviously you are in a tough spot. So, thank you for sending those my way. Hopefully, I was able to help give you some ideas and some support around those various issues. If you do have any other questions, I may be doing more of these. I have some other content I'm brainstorming on, but if you have questions, please feel free to email me. The slide has my email, website, LinkedIn, etc. Of course, my YouTube channel has all of the various webinars that we have done so far this year. If you're not already signed up for my newsletter, if you do this, I usually put out my webinars and anything else going on to my newsletter first so that you all get first bite at the cherry, so to speak. So join that if you haven't already, just to stay in the know. And then questions. We do have about 10 minutes left. So if you're watching this in Premiere mode, you can use the chat box to pop in your question or send it to me in an email. I'll be sticking around for about 10 minutes or so. And otherwise, thank you so much for attending this celebratory Ask Me Anything. And if there are topics that you could use help on in future webinars, please let me know. I would be very interested to hear. All right, thank you.